One night, 8 men, 3 vehicles that looked like they belonged to a construction company. That's what it took. The Americans had been working the same objective for 22 days. 60 operators, 4 Black Hawks, 2 ISR drones running continuous overwatch, and a targeting package that had consumed the combined analytical resources of the NSA's Baghdad station and 2 CIA forward elements. 22 days. Nothing. The British arrived on a Tuesday. They asked for the intelligence file, a reliable vehicle, and 4 days of observation time. The senior American liaison officer, a Delta Force colonel with 3 combat rotations and 2 Silver Stars, later said he thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. 71 hours after the British team inserted, the target was in a holding room at the coalition facility at Balad, uninjured, compliant, accompanied by a leather satchel containing the financial records of the entire northern Iraq AQI network, 17 active cells, 4 external facilitation routes, and the identity of a courier system that had been invisible to American intelligence for 14 months. The Delta colonel read the after-action report twice. Then he walked to the British operations room, put the document on the table, and said 4 words. How do you do that? The answer to that question is not a secret. It is not classified. It is not a matter of better equipment or larger budgets or superior technology. The answer is a story that begins in a Welsh mountain range in January, runs through 80 years of institutional philosophy, and ends in the most violent city on earth with 8 men and a notebook. This is that story. Mosul, northern Iraq, January 2017. The city was bleeding out. The Islamic State's hold on its western districts was fracturing under coalition pressure, but the network infrastructure, the financial conduits, the external facilitation routes, the shadow governance apparatus that had made Mosul the most operationally sophisticated terrorist organization in modern history, was not fracturing. It was migrating, adapting, compressing itself into a smaller, harder, faster configuration, designed to survive the collapse of the physical caliphate and reconstitute in the gaps left behind. The Americans understood this. What they could not do was find it. The Joint Special Operations Command had been running targeted raids against the IS financial network in and around Mosul since late 2016. The model was familiar: satellite imagery, SIGINT intercepts, pattern of life analysis generated over weeks, then a rapid direct action strike. Large force, rapid insertion, violent exploitation, rapid extraction. The system that had worked against Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2007 and 2008, refined over a decade of high-tempo operations into a machine of extraordinary lethality. Against an enemy that used phones. Against an enemy that moved predictably. Against an enemy that left digital traces. The IS financial network in Mosul in 2017 did none of those things. The man at the center of it, a former Iraqi Army signals officer who had spent 15 years thinking about exactly how American surveillance systems worked, had built something specifically designed to be invisible to the tools pointed at it. No phones. No electronic communications of any kind. Couriers only. Face-to-face meetings in locations selected 24 hours in advance and never reused. A financial movement system based on cash and informal hawala transfers that left no banking trace. The Americans had spent 22 days and a resource envelope that a defense analyst later estimated at north of $3 million running surveillance operations against a man who had, essentially, stepped outside the electromagnetic spectrum entirely. The internal assessment, never officially released but described in detail by defense journalist Sean Naylor in his 2015 book on JSOC, concluded that the target represented a collection gap, that existing technical surveillance infrastructure was structurally incapable of resolving. Translation: their tools were pointed at the wrong thing. Into this impasse walked a four-man SAS Rex team, attached to a four-man support element. 8 men. Their request, submitted through the liaison structure of the British Special Forces element embedded at Erbil, was characteristically understated. They wanted the existing intelligence file, everything the Americans had built over 22 days. They wanted vehicular support that didn't look military. They wanted 4 days of uninterrupted observation time with no parallel American operations in the target area, and they wanted to be left alone. The Delta colonel approved the request the same afternoon. He later admitted he had done so partly because he had run out of better ideas, partly. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what those 8 men were. Not what they carried, not what they wore, not what aircraft had delivered them or what communications infrastructure supported them, what they were. The Brecon Beacons, South Wales, January. The temperature on the high moorland runs between -4 and -8 Celsius. Wind speeds average 45 kilometers per hour, gusting to 70 on the exposed ridgelines. The ground is a mixture of peat bog, frozen marsh, and loose shale that defeats waterproofing within hours and destroys ankles without warning. Visibility drops to under 50 meters in the cloud that sits on the upper ground for weeks at a time in winter. There are no trails. There are no markers. There is no support. SAS selection, the formal process, which runs twice annually and accepts applications from across the British Army and other Commonwealth forces, begins here. It runs for 5 weeks in summer, 4 in winter. Candidates carry burgans of 25 kilograms minimum, navigate to checkpoints using map and compass only, and must reach each checkpoint within a time window that is never officially published and never officially confirmed. Miss a checkpoint by 2 minutes and you are R2'd. Return to unit, done. No explanation, no appeal, no second chance in the same intake. The pass rate, across the history of the selection process since it was formalized in the 1950s, runs between 8 and 15% depending on the intake. On the hardest winter courses, it has dropped below 5. A candidate from 2 Para described the final test, a 64-kilometer march over the full Brecon Range carrying 25 kilograms in under 20 hours, as the point where the mountain shows you who you actually are. Most men, he noted, find out they are not who they thought they were. But selection is only the entry ticket. It means nothing by itself. The men who pass proceed to continuation training, a phase that runs for up to a year and cycles through disciplines that would constitute separate specialist courses in most other military systems. Jungle warfare in Belize, combat diving, Halo and HAHO parachuting, combat survival and resistance to interrogation, a phase so psychologically severe that its specific content remains classified, and critically, combat shooting, live fire, hundreds of hours of it. The standard British infantry soldier fires approximately 200 rounds per year in live training. An SAS operator fires between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds per year, every year, for the duration of their service. The result is a technical shooting capability so ingrained that it ceases to be a skill in any conventional sense and becomes something closer to a physiological reflex. Chris Ryan, who served with 22 SAS through the 1980s and the Gulf War, described the difference this way. A good soldier aims. An SAS operator has already fired. But the capability that matters most in the context of Mosul in 2017 is none of the above. Not the physical endurance, not the shooting standards, not the parachuting or the diving or the survival skills. It is patience. The SAS is, institutionally and philosophically, an organization built around the concept of human intelligence. The patient, methodical, analog collection of information through direct human observation, contact, and source handling. This methodology predates the organization itself. David Sterling's original SAS raiding parties in the North African desert in 1940, One succeeded not because they had better weapons or larger numbers than the Axis forces they attacked, but because they spent days, sometimes weeks, in observation positions, mapping patterns of life, identifying vulnerabilities, and selecting strike windows with a precision that made each raid an almost guaranteed success before the first shot was fired. The British called it the long look. The Americans, with characteristic directness, called it lying in the dirt and watching. Both descriptions are accurate. Both undersell what is actually happening. What is actually happening? When an SAS Rex pair establishes an observation post within 100 meters of a target location and holds it for days at a time, is a form of analytical processing that no signals intelligence system has yet been able to replicate. The human eye and brain, directed by an operator trained to suppress his own discomfort and boredom to a degree that would be clinically remarkable in any other context, builds a picture of behavioral pattern that is invisible to cameras, invisible to intercept systems, and invisible to anything that depends on the target doing something electronically detectable. It detects the timing of a courier route, the body language of a man who knows he is being watched versus a man who doesn't, the specific way a target changes his behavior on Tuesdays but not Wednesdays, the contact who always arrives from the north but leaves to the south. Data that no algorithm can generate because it doesn't look like data. This is what the 8 men who arrived in Mosul in January 2017 were carrying, not in their equipment, in their institutional memory. The target's name has never been officially released. In the partially declassified reporting that has emerged through investigative journalism and congressional oversight documentation, he appears under the designation Financial Facilitator Alpha, a label that understates his significance considerably. He was, in the assessment of multiple intelligence analysts who worked his file, the most operationally sophisticated individual in the IS financial infrastructure in northern Iraq. A former signals officer who had served under Saddam's Republican Guard, who had spent 15 years learning how American surveillance systems worked by reading the public record of American intelligence failures, and who had built a parallel financial architecture for the Islamic State that operated entirely outside the electromagnetic spectrum. He had been on the JSOC targeting list for 14 months. In that time, the Americans had mounted 8 separate surveillance operations against him, generated a targeting package running to several hundred pages, and identified 3 separate occasions when they had been within operational striking distance, only to find, when the raid element arrived, that he had moved hours earlier. He was not moving because of intelligence leaks. He was moving because he had established a pattern of behavior specifically designed to defeat a surveillance methodology based on electronic signature. He did not use phones. He did not use the same route twice in the same week. He did not meet the same contact in the same location twice in the same month. He operated on a principle of deliberate unpredictability that was, paradoxically, entirely predictable to someone who had been watching long enough to see the pattern beneath the randomness. The SAS team read the American intelligence file in approximately 3 hours. Then they set it aside. The file was not wrong. It was comprehensive, technically sophisticated, and analytically rigorous. It was also built on a fundamental misdiagnosis. The Americans had been watching the wrong layer of the target's activity, his contacts, his locations, his timing, through a surveillance lens that was designed to detect electronic activity. He had none. So the picture was 23 years in the making and 22 days of surveillance deep, and it showed almost nothing. The SAS team identified a different layer, not what the target was doing, who he was being. They went into ground. 2 operators, working on a 12-hour rotation schedule with the other 2 providing standoff support, established an observation position in a disused commercial property in the market district that the target was known to have visited. twice, separated by 11 weeks. In the American intelligence assessment, those 2 visits were flagged as a possible pattern. To the SAS pair, they were something more specific. A man who only used locations he was certain were clean, returning to a location he had already validated. He would come back. It would take patience to find out when. On day 2, the observation pair identified a courier, not from electronic surveillance, from behavioral observation. A middle-aged man in civilian clothing who visited the market at irregular intervals, purchased small items, and departed on routes that varied in direction but shared one consistent characteristic. They always terminated within 2 blocks of the same residential compound. On day 3, they identified the pattern in the courier's timing. He moved on odd-numbered days, always between 1100 and 1300 local, always in the same general direction from his starting point, regardless of the specific route taken. On day 4, hour 3, the target emerged. He walked into the market at 11:47 local time. He was wearing a white dishdasha and a dark jacket. He carried nothing visible. He moved with the unhurried deliberation of a man who believed, with complete confidence, that he was invisible. He had been invisible for 14 months. He was not invisible now. The observation pair made no transmission, no radio call to the support element, no alert to the coalition command cell, nothing that could register on any detection system the target or his security awareness might have been primed to notice. One operator continued to observe. The other wrote in his notebook, handwriting, paper, the most secure communication system in existence because it requires no signal and leaves no trace until someone physically carries it out. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. 2 men, brief conversation, a small package transferred folded documents from the courier to the target, and separation. The courier departed south. The target moved west through the market interior, paused at a fruit stall for 3 minutes, then moved to a residential entrance 40 meters from the market's western exit. Number confirmed, building confirmed, entry point confirmed. The transmission went out at 14:23 local, compressed, encrypted, brief, grid reference, window, personnel count, support requirement 4 hours from now. At 02:47 the following morning, the target was detained in a ground floor room of the residential building. The 4-man hit element cleared the structure in under 4 minutes. No shots fired, no injuries, no collateral involvement. In the satchel he carried, handwritten ledgers recording financial transactions across 17 IS cells operating in northern Iraq, a list of names, a second list of Hawala transfer routes through Turkey and Lebanon, and a mobile phone, a basic Nokia, apparently never activated, still in its original packaging, in which the SIM card had been modified to store contact information that had never been transmitted electronically, and therefore had never appeared in 14 months of NSA intercept operations. The phone's contact list ran to 34 entries. Within 72 hours of its exploitation, 6 of those individuals had been detained by coalition forces across 3 countries. The Delta colonel received the after-action summary at 06:00. He read it at his desk with a cup of coffee that went cold. Later that morning, he walked to the British operations room. He put the summary document on the table. He looked at the senior SAS officer, a major with an unremarkable face, and the relaxed, slightly distracted manner of a man who has just completed a task that demanded his full concentration and is now thinking about breakfast. "How do you do that?" The major considered the question for a moment. "We watched," he said. "Then we waited, then we went in." The colonel stared at him. "That's it. That's it." It is not, of course, it. The ability to watch with sufficient skill that a courier pattern becomes visible against the noise of a busy market in a contested city takes years to build. The ability to wait, to lie in a hide position for 96 hours in a building without running water or light, eating cold rations, managing bodily functions in sealed containers, maintaining the visual concentration required to track meaningful behavioral data through a gap in a crumbling wall, is not patience in any ordinary sense of the word. It is a physiological and psychological capability that is manufactured over years through a selection and training system of deliberate brutality. And the ability to go in, to translate 96 hours of patient observation into a 4-minute building clearance with 0 casualties, and a complete intelligence exploitation, requires a technical mastery of close-quarters battle that the SAS builds through 200-plus hours of annual live-fire training, sustained across the entire operational career of every operator in the regiment. 3 words: watch, wait, go in. Behind each word, decades. The cost the file doesn't show. It is important to say what this was not. It was not clean, not in any meaningful human sense. The operators who rotated through that observation position over 4 days came out of it carrying the accumulated physical debt of 96 hours without sleep beyond brief tactical rest periods, in a building with no heating in January, in a city where discovery would have meant a response measured in minutes. The medical evidence that emerged through a partially declassified study of British Special Forces welfare over the Iraq and Afghanistan period, published by the Royal Centre for Defence Medicine in 2019, documented chronic hearing damage in over 60% of operators who served 3 or more combat rotations, concussive injury in 45%, musculoskeletal damage severe enough to require surgical intervention in nearly a third. None of that is in the after-action report. The report is a single document, 4 pages. It describes the observation phase, the pattern of life methodology, the direct action, and the intelligence exploitation. It is written in the flat, precise language of professional military reporting. It contains no emotion, no reflection, no acknowledgement of what it costs a human being to sit in the dark for 4 days in a building in Mosul and write in a notebook. Mark Urban, the defense correspondent whose 2010 book Task Force Black remains the definitive account of SAS operations in Iraq, wrote that the men who passed through 22 SAS's Baghdad rotations did not come back the same. He described operators returning from 3rd and 4th tour carrying a quality of stillness that their families found difficult to interpret. Not trauma in any clinical sense. Not damage, exactly. More like weight. Something chosen, and then never fully set down. The institution has never been particularly good at addressing this. The culture that produces the capability, the deliberate selection against men who report difficulty, who acknowledge limitation, who seek support, is structurally hostile to the acknowledgement of cost. The men who pass selection are, almost by definition, men who do not say they are struggling. That quality is the source of the operational excellence. It is also the reason the welfare provision has historically lagged 2 decades behind the operational demand. A parliamentary inquiry in 2020 described the gap between what Special Forces personnel were asked to sustain and what the institution provided in terms of psychological support as significant and in need of urgent review. Significant, in need of urgent review. The language of a system responding, slowly and imperfectly, to a cost it had generated with great precision and acknowledged with great reluctance. This matters, not because it diminishes what was achieved in Mosul in January 2017, but because the achievement is only half the story. The other half is what it takes to be the kind of person who can achieve it. The Delta Colonel's question, "How do you do that?" was not rhetorical. He meant it operationally. He wanted an answer he could implement. The answer he received, 3 words, delivered without drama, was, in its way, the most devastating intelligence assessment of the coalition's operational methodology in northern Iraq. Because the answer could not be implemented, not quickly, not by any system that measures capability in platforms and personnel numbers and annual budgets. The Delta Force is an extraordinary organization. Its operators are among the most technically proficient soldiers in the world. Its selection process is severe, its training rigorous, its operational record across 4 decades of counterterrorism and direct action unmatched by any comparable unit. None of that is in dispute. What is in dispute? What the Mosul operation of January 2017 placed in direct, unambiguous dispute is the premise on which the American Special Operations System is built. The premise that capability scales with resources. That the right intelligence picture, built with sufficient analytical power and sufficient surveillance infrastructure, can substitute for the thing the SAS had spent 8 decades building: the individual operator's ability to watch and wait and understand. A classified assessment prepared by a joint US-UK review team in 2017, described in outline in a Congressional Research Service report on special operations effectiveness, concluded that the British Special Forces model produced results, disproportionate to the investment, in scenarios requiring pattern-of-life intelligence collection against SIGINT-resistant targets. The language is careful. The conclusion is not. The Americans were hunting, the British were studying. The Americans were building targeting packages, the British were building understanding. The Americans were spending 22 days and $3 million. The British were spending 4 days and a notebook. This is not a new lesson. Brigadier Mike Calvert, who commanded the SAS Brigade in Northwest Europe in 1944-45, wrote in his post-war assessment that a small force with superior local knowledge will consistently outperform a large force with superior firepower in any environment where the decisive factor is information rather than mass. That assessment was written 80 years ago. It has not dated. Nor has the underlying reason. The SAS is not better equipped than the Americans. It is not better funded. It is not better supported by a wider intelligence architecture. On every one of those measures, the comparison is not even close. What it is, and has been since David Sterling wrote his founding memo in a Cairo military hospital in 1941, is philosophically different. Sterling's memo, submitted to the Deputy Chief of Staff Middle East without authorization, after Sterling had discharged himself from hospital against medical advice and entered the headquarters building on crutches past a guard who was looking the other way, argued for a unit built on a single principle: the supreme value of the trained individual over the mass of the conventional force. Not the best equipped individual, the best selected, best trained, most patient individual. A soldier whose value came not from the platform he operated or the budget that supported him, but from the quality of his judgment and the depth of his preparation. The regiment that grew from that memo, 1st Special Air Service Regiment, established 6 weeks after Sterling submitted the document, with 65 men and no precedent and nothing but desert and certainty, has never deviated from that principle. Not in the Western Desert in 1941, not in Malaya in 1950, not in Aden in 1967, not in Northern Ireland across 2 decades of patient intelligence work that ultimately contributed more to the resolution of that conflict than any military operation. Not in the Falklands, where 2-man SAS observation teams on the exposed ridgelines above Goose Green provided the intelligence that made the British ground campaign possible. Not in Sierra Leone in 2000, where Operation Barras, a night assault on a rebel jungle camp that freed 11 British soldiers held hostage by the West Side Boys militia, was planned and executed in conditions that left no margin for the failure of any individual in the assault force. And not in Mosul in 2017, with 8 men, 4 days, and a notebook. The Delta colonel submitted a formal request through the coalition liaison structure 2 weeks after the Mosul operation. He wanted to embed 2 American officers with the SAS team for the next deployment cycle, not to assist, to observe. The request was approved. One of those officers, a lieutenant colonel from Delta's assault squadron, later gave an informal debrief to his unit on returning from the attachment. The debrief was described by a journalist with access to people present as running to nearly an hour. Most of it concerned the observation phase, the specific techniques, the rotation schedule, the way data was recorded and cross-referenced and converted into a targeting picture without a single piece of electronic equipment. At the end, someone asked him the obvious question: could they replicate it? He thought about it for a long moment. Not in any useful time frame, he said. What those guys are doing isn't a technique, it's a culture, and cultures take generations to build. He paused. We measured them by our standards. We should have measured them by theirs. 60 American operators, 22 days. Every surveillance system the most powerful intelligence community in the world could bring to bear. 8 British operators, 71 hours, a notebook and a pair of binoculars. The target was in custody by Wednesday morning. Somewhere in the Brecon Beacons right now, in January cold and driving rain, a man is walking alone across a high-exposed ridge with 25 kilograms on his back and a map in his hand. No trails, no markers, no one telling him which way to go. He has been walking for 11 hours. He will walk for another 6 before he reaches the checkpoint. He will either be on time or he won't. If he is on time, he will discover something about himself that nothing else in his life has ever been able to tell him. And 3 years from now, or 5 or 8, some version of what he discovers on that ridge will stand in a building in a city somewhere, patient, invisible, watching, and accomplish something that a force 10 times his size has been unable to accomplish for 3 weeks. Not because of the technology, not because of the budget, because of what was discovered on the ridge. That is the selection. That is the training. That is why we watched, we waited, we went in, is both the simplest and the most complete answer to the question. It always has been.